Hello.
Hi.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I am the Education Assistant at Dunlop Art Gallery, part of Regina Public Library. Welcome to tonight's program, Film School, Dolly Parton, Here I Am. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Dunlop Art Gallery, RPL Film Theatre, Regina Public Library, tonight's presenters, Dr. Charity Marsh and Cassandra Ozog, and the lands on which we're virtually gathered this evening are all situated on Treaty 4 territory. These are the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All right, I would love to take a moment to introduce Charity Marsh, tonight's presenter. Dr. Charity Marsh is Director of the Humanities Research Institute and Director of Interactive Media and Performance Labs at the University of Regina, which is located on Treaty 4 lands. She is Associate Professor in Creative Technologies and Interdisciplinary Programs in the Faculty of MAP. Dr. Marsh's research focuses on hip-hop cultures, gender and technology, community arts-based education, and artists such as York, Madonna, and Peaches. She directed and produced the documentary I'm Gonna Play Loud, Girls Rock Regina and the Ripple Effect in 2020, as well as We Need Rock Camp, a series of shorts about the importance of GERD on youth. Her co-edited collection, We Still Hear Hip Hop North of the 49th Parallel, was published in 2020 with McGill Queen's University Press. Along with her kiddos, Ilse and Axel Lena, Charity produces the weekly radio show Imagine This Music for 91.3 FM CJTR Regina Community Radio. Welcome, Charity.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's good to be back. Exciting. So I just want to talk for a brief moment and say, before we bring in our special guest today and I introduce Cassie, because lots of you will know Cassie, I just want to say, first of all, that I've curated these 3 films, and in particular focusing on women in popular music. So last month we had the film about Nina Simone. Today we're talking about Dolly Parton. And next month we're talking about Beyonce and looking at her film Homecoming. I think right now, it's really not just right now, but always it's important to be thinking about how people are represented, whether they're representing themselves in film and these kinds of media, types of media, or whether or not others are doing it for them, how they're being represented, all kinds of those like interesting questions that we're going to get. And I think these 3 films as a series together helps open up hopefully lots of dialogue around that, and so many issues. So, but let me introduce Cassie. Cassie has joined us, and so Cassandra Ozog is a PhD candidate at the University of Regina on Treaty 4 territory, and she, I'm really excited about that because I'm on that committee, and it's very exciting work. So, she examines representations of mental illness in the media. She's also a sessional instructor at the University of Regina and has taught courses on inequality and social justice, mass media, the sociology of mental illness, and Indigenous health policy and research. So Cassie is a co-owner of a local eco-friendly store, Mortis and Tenon, and is passionate about community-driven research, challenging ableist notions of health and well-being, and supporting community-based justice initiatives. She's also part of Girls Rock as one of our mentors and coaches, which isn't in here, but I think is important to say. And she might be Dolly Parton's biggest fan, but is open to sharing that title. And so welcome, welcome, Cassie. I think we should just start off. I'll tell you a little bit about how it's going to go tonight. So for the folks at home, everyone gets to know what's happening if you haven't joined us for film school before. Basically, we're going to have a conversation about the film. And we're going to show us a short clips from the film and have those as part of our conversation. And those folks watching us at home or from wherever you are, but you're probably watching from home, or maybe you're in the lineup, wherever you are. Viewers can engage with us by typing your thoughts in the comments section, or alternatively, you can use hashtag RPL Film School and at RPL Film Theater on Twitter. And Sarah from Dunlop she'll be monitoring both and reposting on this stream so we can hopefully get to some of your questions and comments. So this film, right? So Dolly Parton, Here I Am. It's really begins and takes us, starts talking about her, and really it's a celebration of the 50th year Jubilee as a member of the Grand Ole Opry. And so this is a moment of Dolly. She's having this sort of millennial moment, and we're going to talk about that. But let's begin the whole conversation with asking Cassie about your fandom and why you are such a big Dolly fan. And I think that's like that's an important question and story for all of us to hear.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for the lovely intro, Charity, and thank you to the RPL Film Theater and Dunlop Art Gallery, Sarah and Eric, of course, who are running the show tonight. Thanks everybody for having me. I'm glad to be here. Yeah, this is hilarious because I think a lot of folks who know me now at this point in my life know I'm a big Dolly Parton fan. And, you know, it's like every time Dolly's in the news, anytime something comes up, if somebody sees a coffee mug with Dolly Parton on it when they're traveling halfway around the world, like I get that photo texted to me and I love it so much. But what a lot of folks don't realize is that I actually have been a Dolly Parton fan since I was quite little. And I have one Dolly record behind me. I have many Dolly records, as you can imagine. But I actually brought Dolly's Greatest Hits. And this was released in 1982. So for context, I was born in 84. So this was released 2 years before I was born. This was in my parents' music collection. My parents loved music. My dad liked a lot of like rock and roll, a lot of stuff in the 70s, a lot of CCR, a lot of Led Zeppelin, that kind of thing. But my mom and my mom's parents very much came from this background of like old school country, like the June and, you know, and Johnny and you know, Waylon Jennings and just the whole thing. But Dolly Parton was a big thing that my mom really grew up with. So she had some Dolly records, and I have a very visceral memory of being a kid and like pulling out the records. And of course, like all the really youngins, well, maybe now they do, but just that joy of opening up and discovering. And for me, it was like, you open this record and it's just a million pictures of Dolly. And like, how would you not just be fascinated with this human being? And I think that was it for me, is that I just, as a kid, I looked at her and she looked like a Barbie. She looked like a cartoon character. And it's funny because later hearing the story about how Dolly kind of developed her look based on a woman she saw when she was little, who she jokes her mom said was the town tramp, and she just thought she was beautiful. I kind of had the same experience where I thought, this is the most beautiful creature I've ever seen. She's not real. And so as a kid, that was really enticing to me. But then as I got older, like I still had this love of Dolly, and I played in a lot of punk rock bands. I always had an interest in other rock bands. I like the Lunatics, for example, from New York, who were a very theatrical, kind of trashy punk rock band. They dressed up in like pretty dresses and lots of makeup and wigs, but were kind of trashy around it. And so that's still that theatrical element of that performance was something I was always really interested in. And I also moved into doing some acoustic music myself after kind of playing in punk bands for a bit. And of course, like going back to a lot of bluegrass and country roots in doing that. And so she's always kind of been with me. And then later on in my life, I read a story about Dolly that I didn't realize. And that was a story about how she had actually struggled pretty tremendously with depression and just really not being able to get out of bed, not being able to move. She'd put on weight. She just couldn't kind of see the point of living. She'd had some health issues. And I remember reading that, and it was kind of, when I discovered this story, it was kind of around the same time that I was also starting to unpack some of my own struggles with mental illness. So I live with mental illness. I live with anxiety and depression as well. And so seeing somebody who's always this like, oh, to get the rainbow, you got to put up with the rain, this bright sunshine flower that had kind of followed me my whole life, to also know that she was this very complex human was really this powerful moment. And so, and I know I've said this to you before, Charity, and I've said this to a few people, but Dolly has kind of kept being important in my life, but she's become important for different reasons at different times in my life when I needed it. And I think that's kind of one of the really cool things about who she is that there's always these really interesting layers to her that if you're not, you know, a regular fan who's following that, you might kind of miss it. You might just kind of get to enjoy the beauty that's Dolly, and that's great. But for me, it was definitely something that kind of unwrapped over time, and it still is. And now in my life, as I'm really following this kind of this Dolly renaissance, this millennial moment you were saying, I'm seeing too how she very carefully manages her boundaries and manages her public profile. And those are things I'm thinking about too, as I move through my career and do those kinds of things as well. And in my personal life, I'm working on some of that stuff too. So there's just always these different pieces of Dolly that just always seem to kind of echo back to where I'm at in my life. And I don't know if that's happenstance, but it's just kind of always worked out that way. And it's just kind of really kept me connected to her.
I think it's an incredible story, especially to think about these artists that are with you from childhood, and that are such an important. They have such an important role in your childhood, in your family setting, the way that you identify. And then, of course, with Dolly, I mean, she has had such an incredibly long career,
Right.
well before you were born, and has carried through. And so, I mean, there's just so much there. And yes, I think you've touched on a number of things that I think we're going to talk a little bit more about, like around her personal boundaries, around her glass half full, always, the brand that she has created for herself and is very protective of and manages very, very in a savvy kind of way. So these are the kinds of things that I think we'll get to even more. But thanks so much for sharing that, because there's lots there. And also, I guess it's always pretty powerful to see others that you can identify with, especially around those really those struggles in your own life and then in others, and to see the kinds of ways, maybe strategies that other people use, etc., those kinds of things. But
yeah. Well, I mean, Dolly Parton credits Sylvester Stallone with pulling her out of depression. I didn't get to have that particular tool, but lots of therapy with other people. Not Sylvester Stallone was great, but yeah, it's sometimes when I hate to use the stars, they're just like us, because they're not. They have lots of privilege. They have a lot of other things and opportunities that we don't. But when you see somebody you admire be open about a struggle that you've had, especially when it's somebody, like you said, that's just kind of stayed with you since childhood, it's a good reminder of like, okay, all right, like I've got this, in a different way, but I've got this. Yeah.
Well, let's go to the first clip. I know Eric's going to set that up, and then we'll get to a little bit more of this. Thanks so much. Let's do this, Eric, if you're ready.
I actually take my songwriting more serious than anything else I do. So I would say I am a songwriter first. It's my way of expressing myself. It is my therapy. You have to search for a long time because I've written a lot of songs. But yes, there are pieces of me, of course, in everything I write.
All right, so I mean, it's a very lovely, that's right near the beginning of it. Obviously, it gives the title. There's a little bit before, but I think one of the things that's so wonderful about that is how she views herself and the thing that's most important to her, and that is songwriting. And so we can talk a little bit about that, because I think it's one of the things too that we, whether we respect that in an artist. But with Dolly, it's often not, we don't talk about it in the same way, even though she's been incredibly prolific, thousands of songs that she's written for herself, but also for many others. And just how, I love how she said, you'll have to listen to a whole bunch, but yes, there's little bits, like, of course, this autobiography, which is also interesting considering the kinds of boundaries that she has made for herself in her personal life, right from the beginning, right? So right early on. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that, especially within the sort of celebrity culture world that we're in now, that she is thriving in.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I like what you said, like very often we don't talk about Dolly as a songwriter. And I find that so interesting, because she was just recently, in the years escaping me, if somebody Googles it and throws it in the comments, I'll be forever grateful. But just actually very recently, she was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. And there was all these stories that popped up around it, and a lot of people, and I have the really bad habit of getting into the comment sections on articles. I'm working on not doing that anymore. But when it's a story I like, I'm like, okay, this will be positive. And so many people are like, oh, I just didn't realize Dolly Parton had written that many songs. And again, if you follow her career and read the stories and read these things, she says it in this documentary, she's written thousands and thousands and thousands of songs. And I think it's Linda Perry in this documentary too, who says that she has songs that nobody's even heard, you know, kind of things that you have heard about somebody like Prince for years, right? That, oh, there were all these songs that even after he unfortunately passed away far too soon, that it was, oh, there's all these songs still in the vault, right? And I think we talk a lot about it with male artists as well, and we don't often talk about it with female artists. But yeah, she's written, that's really the thing that's been her greatest accomplishment alongside this career, is just how prolific of a songwriter she is. But we just do not talk about it. So it's really important to recognize that, so that she's not just written off as this one-dimensional thing.
Well, and I think that's the thing, right? Because of her performance, because of Dolly Parton, this incredible character that she has created, oftentimes the focus is very much on that, right? On her looks, on you know, all of the her physical attributes, all of that as always something that comes to the front, and certainly in a knowing way. I mean, I think about some of these you know, current artists today, and thinking about how they handle celebrity stardom, or it isn't handled in the same way, or how even, for example, there's just an understanding, these boundaries were set by her, the media, like the paparazzi, things like that, they're not crossing them. With certain artists, whereas other artists are like fair game, and it's just, you know, so I was thinking about this, but this the sort of legitimacy of her that is given around that sort of credibility around songwriting, because again, you know, I mean, this is also too someone who crosses boundaries, genre boundaries. So whether it's country, whether it's bluegrass, whether it's pop, you know, she kind of slides all over the place. And oftentimes what we see there is these kinds of
stereotypes
and mapping of women artists, and not necessarily given the credit of writing, right?
Yeah. So. And it's interesting because Dolly is really set, as you said, these very clear boundaries. And it's interesting because you'll be talking about Beyonce next week. And Beyonce is somebody I would think of a more contemporary artist who has tried very hard to set those personal boundaries. And the paparazzi has not always respected that either, even though Beyonce does not reveal, if you've read enough of her interviews and pieces, she does not reveal anything that she doesn't want the public to know about, right? There are not a lot of paparazzi pictures of her kids flying around. She's been very fiercely protective of that. But there's something about the boundary that Dolly has set. And I think we'll probably get into this, but a lot of that is because she kind of gets ahead of it, right? Any joke about Dolly, she's made, you know, and all of that kind of thing. But yet, because she's always kind of making the joke and wheeling and dealing, and she's almost kind of the don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. Right. And so I think that unfortunately in that process of the big spectacle, where she can kind of direct people to the spectacle and away from her personal life, I do think that legitimacy around what a prolific songwriter she is also maybe gets lost in the mix.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then I think, again, even this film, Dolly Parton, Here I Am, like the title says it, this is what she wants you to know right now, where she's at. She's setting it up, and this is right at the beginning. So this is obviously something very at this point in her career, in her life, she wants it to be known, you know, that songwriting, I think of that of myself as a songwriter first, and then, you know, and carries on and talks about all of the songs. Right. And then of course the savvy around the decisions she makes about, for example, who she allows to use her song or to, you know, record her songs.
Right.
And of course it comes up, right, that Elvis wanted, you know, I Will Always Love You. And she, you know, it was a really great decision at the time, but a hard decision for her, but in the sense, of course. And then she talks about I never heard my song like that, the way Whitney Houston did it. And she made me a ton of money. And that's just straight up, right? Like it's kind of an interesting way about
Well,
her.
and if you think about, like, Elvis Presley had a beautiful voice, but Elvis Presley, and I don't want to get any hate mail about this, do not at me about this, but Elvis Presley has had nothing on Whitney Houston. And
I'm in total agreement. So
I know you are.
bring the hate mail. Here we go.
You're ready for the how dare you? But it's like, let's be real. Whitney Houston took that song, but that's another prolific artist who took that song and made it completely her own. And you can tell how much Dolly respected her for doing that. But again, yeah, that whole straight up, like, she made me a ton of money. But even she knew then. That's one thing I love about her. She knew then, when she wasn't the big Dolly Parton star that she is now, she knew how good that song was. She knew that was the best song she'd ever written. Like, she, you know, arguably that is probably the best song she's ever written. And she knew it, like, just had that much confidence to know, like, this is going to pay my family's bills one day, this song. Like, this is it. and you have to respect that. That's a boss move.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, right? Because of course, this is that idea that this song was, you know, to help her break up her business partnership relationship. But I think why don't we think about that? Because I think this is also that why did I've just lost his name? Porter
Wagoner.
Thank you. Porter is now kind of in this place of, like, for her in this piece, in this documentary, we get to see this lovely moment of her talking about that song. And there are two sort of different interpretations of what's, how they see it. So why she wrote it, how it was written, who it was written for, etc. So, but why don't we go to the next clip? Because I think this will set us up to talk more about some of these things. So Eric, if you're
perfect,
good, let's do the second clip.
Well, good morning, Captain. I came here early on Saturday morning with my little beat-up suitcase of songs, my little old guitar and ragged little clothes. Good morning to you, sir. Hey, hey, yeah. I was hungry, cried myself to sleep every night. But I did learn early on that you really had to stand up for yourself, especially being a girl in business at that time, and a country girl that did look like a dumb blonde.
All right.
I love that song too.
So, well, why don't we just, there is a question and it's about what we were just talking about. So why don't we answer that question? Cassie?
Sure.
So, Cassie, what is your favorite song that Dolly wrote by someone else, but someone else sang, and why?
And I think that might be Susie. I might be wrong, but given the
username, I can't tell from the.
I think it might be, but I kind of already answered it, and maybe I don't know if that's an easy answer or what. But I would say I Will Always Love You, because I think Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston is one of my favorite vocalists. Whenever I'm teaching at Girls Rock Camp and I'm mentoring as a vocalist, I often have the kids, and when it's like really young kids, like they don't know who Whitney Houston is. So it's like a personal mission of like, I need you to go home and give this list of names to your parents to YouTube for you. Just like in case you're not allowed to use YouTube yet. Because we sometimes have very young ones at Girls Rock. If you're old enough to, here's what you do. And I show them, I make them watch that video. I Will Always Love You, and I make them watch Whitney Houston's mouth, because like, just if you're a singer, if you're somebody who's been trained, you watch the way she moves her jaw, you watch where her tongue is, like everything about, like, I could go on, and I'm going on a tangent, I know, but the way that Whitney Houston sings and the talent that she had was nearly unmatchable, I would say, in this world. And so I think when you hear Dolly Parton's original version and you know the story behind that song, and it's so heartbreaking and so beautiful and so soft and just kind of delicate, this kind of soft goodbye, and then Whitney Houston takes it and turns it into a very different kind of song, just to see another strong woman sing it, that is my favorite. I think you can't get better than that.
That's a good answer. I was going to say, that is one of my favorites. I'm also like, lately I've really been going along with Jolene and the White Stripes. I'm just rocking out to this this
That's
version.
a good one. That's a good runner-up, I would say. Yeah.
So, but yes, for all the reasons that you said, I think it's important to recognize that, and just the beauty of very different genres within it, singing, but different voices, and the way that artists interpret, and how lovely that is. So thank you for the question. Let's turn back to this clip. We just watched that beautiful, and she says, I learned early on you really had to stand up for yourself, especially being a girl in business, a country girl that did look like a dumb blonde. And so I think one of the things we need to think about when we talk about Dolly is how she takes on these characters, these kind of stereotypes, and she uses them and sort of flips it on the audience or on others to almost like taking back power in a kind of way. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that, because of course this, within that we can talk about how she plays with stereotypes, not just dumb blonde, but certainly a number of other stereotypes. And what do you think about that? How does that within your feminist politics, how do we start to think about those kinds of things?
I've heard a lot of critiques of Dolly over the years about how she plays into the very much like the patriarchal, like the cis heteronormative male gaze. And I don't disagree with that. But I also think that within that framework, sometimes you have to use the tools that are given to you at the time that they're given. And when you think about when Dolly came up, I mean, she was coming up in the 30s and 40s and 50s when, and I don't know if we'll talk about this, but like even some of the clips in the documentary where Porter Wagner's like, oh, here comes little Miss Dolly and her little guitar. It's like, why is the guitar little? Like, why? It's a regular size guitar. But that consistent demeaning thing. And so there were a lot of women who didn't do that, right? There were a lot of women, I think of somebody like Loretta Lynn, who, kind of pushed against that, certainly still dressed in a very femme way, but kind of pushed against that real ditzy kind of femininity. And that was amazing. And I have nothing but respect for Loretta Lynn too, right? These were folks who were doing the best they could in the barriers that they had at that time. And I think Dolly, and we've kind of talked about this previously in the documentary, she talks about, like, I know men. Like, I know the nature of this. And so she chose a strategy to maneuver her way through. And I do think that, you can critique that, you can be in favor of that. She was working within the system. But what's really interesting about it, I think, is that, again, it was almost this decoy that she kind of knew. And she said this, not necessarily in this documentary, but I know, and I know you really like this podcast as well, but I think both Cherry and I would encourage people, if you haven't, listen to the podcast, Dolly Parton's America. It's 10 episodes, and it's some of the best Dolly Parton investigations I would say I've ever heard, and really great interviews with her again. And again, it's this kind of idea of like, she could distract them a little bit, because if people just thought she was some dumb blonde who came into the room, they didn't necessarily see her kind of, winning them over and getting a better deal than maybe she thought she would. Was she playing into the hands of patriarchal gaze? Absolutely. Did she make it work to her benefit? Also, absolutely. So it's complex and a little bit murky, but she made the stereotypes work for her and built an empire around it. And at the end of the day, like, if you don't know the story of Porter Wagner, like, Porter Wagner went broke. He, his career was already on a decline by the time Dolly joined his show. And, later on, there's the story, and you hear about that on Dolly Parton's America, that she ended up, when he was going fully broke and the family had no money, she went in and bought all the rights to his entire catalog, which was a lot of money, millions of dollars. And then, because they were in danger of losing it, and then gifted those back to his family. Right. But that's the thing, is that she had the money to do that. She built that. So however you define success is certainly up to you. And you're also within that capitalist, right, structure of, she makes a lot of jokes about making a lot of money, but she made it work for her.
Well, and I think, this is also something that there is, and I think we need to unpack some of this, like Dolly's whiteness, this kinds of religiousness that she clings to, or not clings to, but uses as the way of giving back. I mean, she, like, her philanthropy, like, she's just an incredible person in that way. But there are lots of things about that. Like, so for example, yes, she also, not only that, we know that she also had to pay a great deal of money to get out of her contract and leave that show. Yeah, so lots of tension in that relationship, but also a recognition in everything, whether it's this particular documentary, the film we're talking about tonight, Here I Am, whether it's in, Dolly Parton's America, in that great podcast, other cases, she's always recognized the importance of the career growth that happened during that time on that show, and that relationship, that partnership with him, and how it did, it moved her into a different kind of sphere. And so I think, there is certainly, that is key. There was something else that you talked about, and it's just caught my mind, but the stereotypes coming. I'm looking at the image behind you on the vinyl. I think there's something to be said for her to continue to create and use an image that, of course, has been so often used against. And as a very young, 17 years old, heading to Nashville on her own, during, at a particular time when certainly, and then how she actually engages politically with a lot of these issues of sexism, of inequalities between this, all of this kind of thing, where she starts doing that in her music, and is very, like, it's straight up there, like those songs are right there, and doing the thing. Same, I'm thinking of when you mentioned Loretta Lynn, and of course, yes, Loretta Lynn is a little bit more of that, like, let's go outside, I'm gonna take you on, right? She even talks about that in one of her songs, right?
Cool City, yeah.
And The Pill, Loretta Lynn, I'm thinking about all of those, but then I'm thinking also about Dolly's, like the track record of all of these. She even claims that maybe one of her songs might have been one of the early Me Too movement, and then she runs away from that immediately.
Yeah.
What did I just say?
Yeah.
So the sort of incredible feminist politics, I suppose, that they are especially for that time, and speaking out, and then of course moving on to the anthem of like 9 to 5, right. Etc. Right,
but she's careful.
Yeah.
She's very careful. And I think you brought up, and that is important to note, like, again, with Loretta Lynn and June Carter and a lot of these, like, women we admire, like, these are all white women, right? So even then, like, there was the ability to use her whiteness. And you'll really notice with Dolly's identity, she'll always go back to the Smoky Mountains, poor as dirt, right? And very much Christian family and that kind of thing. But she doesn't always address her whiteness. And that definitely was part of, being a pretty young white girl, definitely was what got her into the room. Right. And so how she chooses to use that, I would say, and that's probably, I think it's a fair critique of Dolly, is that recognizing her privilege isn't always something that comes up, because she'll still also have a little bit of that bootstrapping language around, like, oh yeah, I just think women and men, everybody should be treated equally, or just like, women can have it too, as long as they work hard enough. Like, there's still that language that comes in there that's also very much rooted in that, well, especially at the time that she was growing up, that kind of American dream, post-depression, like, the world is your oyster if you work hard enough, right? And so there's definitely that ideology that's present in the language that she uses and how she describes herself, right? It wasn't actually until 2020, this past year, where I think it was the first time I've actually really heard Dolly acknowledge her whiteness, right? And that was in response to the murder of George Floyd, right? And kind of this resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it was a late response, mind you, but at the same time, I don't think it was kind of off brand for Dolly. I don't think I've ever heard her say something that outright political about race before, ever in her career. And it was great. Yeah, it was positive, but very surprising, actually.
I was thinking about that because in the podcast, they do take her on a little bit, especially about the stampede, right? Like, yes. And having to change well, she chose to change the name. I
Mhm.
think, and it was that sense as, is this a business decision? Is this, what kind of decision is it? And so they do get at it a little bit there, and you can see it's a little bit of a maybe. It's probably one of the most uncomfortable, next to the being in the squish between Lily Tomlin and Jane Fonda talking about Trump, but like it's like a very uncomfortable place for her. But then, yes, this was certainly not part of the brand. And maybe why don't we go that this is something coming up in the next clip. So why don't we play the next clip, and Eric and we'll talk about that next.
Dolly won't do anything that will render uncomfortable the people who love her. And it's a very broad swath of people, I think. Politically, very broad. Socially, economically, very broad. She is first and foremost an entertainer. She wants people to feel good. So if she feels that identifying as a feminist will make some of those people who love her uncomfortable, she's not going to say that. But her life is the life of a feminist, which means a woman who has fought to realize herself, to actualize her full self.
Now I know that I'm no angel, if that's what you thought you'd found. I was just the victim of a man that let me down.
She's mastered the design of how to be a woman and succeed in this business without making a man feel bad. In fact, without anybody making anybody feel bad.
Dolly, I read.
Yes. Wow.
Much to unpack.
Yeah. So yes. Well, yeah. But where do you want to start? I think there's something really interesting there about how others view her, politics, and how others have to reconcile, the way that she chooses to be politically not, or politically out, explicit or implicit, or again, these boundaries that she puts up, right? So what do you, let's unpack that, because those are two very different, interesting takes too. But also this idea of how they each set it up is,
yeah. I always think it's interesting this issue around people labeling themselves as feminist. There is and I've talked to you about this a million times, and anybody who knows me knows I'll go on a rant about how the 2000s were a dark time in popular culture, especially for women. But you can find a ton of magazine articles, especially in magazines targeted at younger audiences, of kind of female, Pop-Tarts and Startlets saying like, well, I don't really identify as a feminist, because feminism has always been this dirty word. Feminism is always this man-hating shrew, right? And so for Dolly, she in ideology, in the way she moves through the world, in how she sees herself and sees other women and sees everything, like very much a feminist, right? And again, that reminder that feminism isn't just this one monolith way of being, right? Now, is she intersectional in her feminism? Maybe not so much, right? But it's interesting because there is just that kind of, Jane Fonda saying, well, she doesn't really identify as a feminist. And it's like, and then of course it's coming from Jane Fonda. I mean, what was her nickname in the 70s? Was it Hanoi Jane? Because she was so actively against the Vietnam War, right? That she was in such a in your face, like in terms of her feminism, in terms of her politics. And Dolly, behind closed doors, could be just as much, but you don't see it. And then that kind of leads into that Linda Perry thing where it's like, yeah, she never makes anybody feel bad. Everybody feels good to be around her. And so that might suggest that if somebody says something inappropriate or racist or sexist, that maybe Dolly doesn't always correct them, which of course we know is kind of being implicitly part of that structure of oppression. But at the same time, she's also utilized it because look at how much Dolly has lifted up other women in her career, how much she has like made sure that she's had these moments of activism that haven't always been explicit, as you say, they've been a bit more implicit, right? And she'll answer questions in an interesting way. Like we were talking earlier about her, Dolly identifies very much as very Christian, like very much has a strong relationship with God, but does not throw in with the kind of Christianity that stands for hate. So Christianity that is, really rooted in homophobia or transphobia, like Dolly, no, not interested. Those are not my people. And that's not it at all.
So yeah, I mean, it's like she takes on a particular kind of notion of like loving and everybody deserving of these things, and yet, of course, we know that is not the world we live in. Certainly not the world that she moves. Like she's the privilege of the things. But I think coming back to that feminism, it's interesting, of course, that she kind of hitches herself though to people like Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin.
Yeah.
And 9 to 5, and writes this incredible anthem, and in previous works, writes very specifically and overtly about, just it's not okay just because I'm a woman, it doesn't mean it's the, like these going back to a number of these lyrics. But I was thinking about how much, and I asked this question too with Nina Simone, right? It was like, what are as fans or people, as celebrities, what are their responsibilities? Are there responsibilities, expectations, especially around issues of social justice? Do we expect that kind of work to be done by certain artists and not others? Is there a sense, like even within genre, I mean, does she get away with a lot because of the countryness of this, like that sense of, well, you have to be careful. Look what happens when you speak out. We know what happens. Look what happens to the Chicks, or formerly the Dixie Chicks, right? When Natalie Maine spoke out, there's a great penalty that is paid musically within some areas in different kinds of ways. I mean, we've seen, we talked about bringing Britney into this conversation, Britney Spears, and certainly the price that certain artists, primarily women too, are pay, or the expectations around their behavior, the expectations around their how they are supposed to be and live in the world, both in their private lives and their public lives. There's something there, I think, that we need to consider, right, in different kinds of ways.
Yeah.
But, yes. So you were saying the 2000s. I'm thinking, let's talk. There's Britney, right?
Well, and the Chicks, right? And I think, and it's interesting because I agree with you, and that price of speaking out. I want to touch really quickly on the celebrity thing too, because that's always something that's in my mind about how, as a big Dolly fan, I was waiting for her to say something about Black Lives Matter, and waiting for her to say something about, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Like I was waiting for her to say something. And then there's kind of this moment of, why do I need a celebrity to say something? I know this is important. We should all know this is important, but we still live in this structure where we really value celebrity, right? We're still very hyper-focused on celebrity and who they are and what they do. So when a celebrity does come out and say something very political, it can have a lot of power. And I think that's why sometimes we cling to it, because we're like, I always thought, man, if Dolly said one thing about Trump during his presidency, that could have changed the game. Maybe not, likely not. But you wonder, right? Like, what kind of power could they have? But on the flip side, it's, have we given those celebrities too much power? So that's something I'm always kind of thinking about with those questions. But yeah, when you get into like the speaking out and the social justice stuff, it's funny because, as you noted, like even Loretta Lynn, The Pill, like she was banned from airwaves for that song, right? But then at the same time, you had Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings, and you had the Highwaymen, and you had, Johnny Cash, like the content of his songs was very, very challenging in terms of some social justice considerations. The man played at a prison, like for a very particular reason, but was not punished for that, right? So there's also the gender aspect that comes in. And so when, women or non-binary or trans artists speak out, we know they face far more scrutiny, right, than a lot of other performers that do. And I think the Chicks is a really perfect example. And I think Dolly even talks about it in the podcast, right, that she didn't want what happened. Nobody wanted what happened to the Chicks to happen to them, right? But we really, especially something happened in the 2000s where we really put a spotlight on female celebrity, and we attacked, like, as a society. Britney Spears, that documentary Framing Britney Spears does a really good job of examining the media lens, how the Dixie, or excuse me, I guess the Chicks, like, did their careers ever really recover? In some ways they did, but that's because they had to switch genres. When
They, yeah. And they certainly, yeah, it is true. And I just think about the sort of elements of that, and particularly at that time, right? That was, you know, that's the old gatekeeping, the radio, like, we're not going to play your record. And that's like you think about that, you think about payola scandal, you think about all of that, and you're thinking, now how can that even be? Because the way we, you know, consume music now online, and is so, it, like, how that has changed, the technology of that, how to, you know, charting and all of those kinds of things. You know, we even see that talked about a little bit in this film. For Dolly, right? How she went through that period where it was Dolly saturation, and then there was seemed to be a bit of a lull, and she decided, okay, I'm gonna go back to my roots and I'm gonna make some bluegrass albums, and, you know, toured, and it was a very not the kind of tour that she had been used to, and then what, you know, and then here she is now at this point selling, well, prior to COVID, right? Selling out stadium after stadium, rocking out, and you know, in her 70s. And that's one thing I would like to talk about, is this aging in women in women in popular music, and how she manages to navigate that in you know, in ways that perhaps others don't. And I mean, we've talked a little bit about this, of course, the use of camp as one thing, the sort of kind of how she's all, as you had said, like, she's always out in front of things. She's making the joke first. But maybe I'm just watching the time. Why don't we play this last clip, and then we can kind of get to that and wrap things right up for us.
Sounds
Eric,
good.
good. Let's do that last clip.
Well, it kind of does. Actually, I have 3 closets in this room, but this one is the most special because this holds all of my stage clothes, and all of these clothes are hand washable. I just put them in the sink in a motel room. I just rinse them out. They're wrinkle free. I don't have to iron them. Okay, now this is my couch. Also, this is my bed. And then up here in these cabinets are my wigs. So here's another dolly, and another one, and another one. And
you don't have to look like this. You're very beautiful. You don't have to wear the blonde wigs. You don't have to wear the extreme clothes, right?
no, it's certainly a choice. I don't like to be like everybody else. I've often made this statement that I would never stoop so low as to be fashionable. That's the easiest thing in the world to do. So I just decided that I would do something that would at least get the attention. Once they got past the shock of the ridiculous way I looked and all that, then they would see there was parts of me to be appreciated. Show business is a money-making joke, and I just always liked telling jokes, you know.
But do you ever feel that you're a joke, that people make fun of you?
Oh, I know they make fun of me. But actually, all these years, the people, you know, has thought the joke was on me, but it's actually been on the public. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I can change it at any time.
All right.
Barbara Walters.
Anyway, I can just struggle with her, but you know, did you know you didn't have to look like that? Just anyway, so yeah, we could talk about that, but then she flips it around, and I love how she's straight up about that, and just, you know, but so if we think about this, how like aging in the music industry is not an easy thing, especially for women. For men, it's a little bit different, right? They age and they become more somehow, you know, more sexy, more authentic, all of those kinds of stereotypes that we don't, I mean, I can unpack all of that, but let's stay focused on Dolly. And so, you know, like this kind of engagement with age, engagement with all of the things that she does to continue to look like Dolly Parton, you know, being very upfront about that, talking about this joke, you know, like using using camp in a kind of particular way, but and noticing, like suggesting, you know, this is part of being an entertainer. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about that. We have about 10 minutes left. I also will throw it to Sarah. If there are any questions, if you want to let me know, that would be great. But why don't we talk about that, Cassie? What do you think? Aging in music industry.
It's so funny because it's like so many of these questions we're having are just things I've like aggressively, I shouldn't say aggressively, I've passionately texted to you, to Charity. I have a lot of like, and another thing, and did you watch the documentary on Tina Turner? And let's have this conversation. And I think what's interesting is that you really hit a point on it, right? That men are allowed to age, whether it's in the music industry, whether it's in the film industry. I mean, once men age, that's when they get an Oscar, right? Like, women have to change how they look and look less beautiful to win their Oscars. That's a whole other rant. But women are not allowed to age. But if they do age, they had better own it, right? And they better do something about it. And then if they do something about it, they'd also better own it and get out in front of it. We've talked about this, Dolly, Cher, like there's a lot of like female celebrities who have very much been open about that they've had work done. They won't necessarily say what kind of work they had done, but they're very clear about it, right? And then they face a lot of scrutiny for that. And then that's why Dolly will get out in front and make jokes. Cher has made the joke that she's mostly silicone at this point, and they don't really care, but we're okay with that because they admit to it. They're not lying or evading, right? We don't like what we perceive to be misconception or misdirection when somebody does that. And they also quote unquote act their age, right? I know you and I've had that conversation. I know you're a big Madonna fan, and if you think about somebody like Dolly, she stands and sings, and I saw Dolly perform a few years ago, and she's active on stage, but she's not doing the same things Madonna's doing on stage. Right. And we have a lot of critique around Madonna, somebody like Madonna, for acting not her age.
Well, and that's it, right? Madonna pushes the boundaries physically in a number of ways where it's like she's challenging what it means to act a certain age and suggesting, so she challenges boundaries. I mean, there's lots of issues with Madonna too, but she challenges those boundaries around, we can no longer think that a certain aged body can only do these certain things and has to be categorized. Right. But she's penalized heavily for that, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas Madonna, Cher, like these are women that age, but that use age, and they engage with these kind of aging the caricatures that come with age.
Right. Yeah. Right? Yeah. As you said, they're a little bit campy. They're a little bit funny. They're a little bit silly. They almost remind you of your trashy grandma, and you're okay with it, like, because they fit into a caricature. And again, for Dolly, I think in terms of how she's navigated aging, it's really just been about continuing that public image of what Dolly is, right? So when she was younger, she was like, hey, I'm not a dumb blonde. And then as she got older, she's like, hey, I'm kind of this kind of saucy minx, like as I'm moving through into my solo career. And now I'm a movie star. Don't mind me. I'm just in Steel Magnolias alongside, Sally Field, Oscar winners. It's fine, right? Also, R.I.P. Olivia Dukakis. That was heartbreaking just the other day, also one of the stars of Steel Magnolias. But again, like she just kind of kept reinventing herself. But in that reinvention, it was kind of just painting a new face or a different angle on that public figure she'd already put forward. And I think that's part of the aging is, again, you can't find a joke about Dolly Parton that she didn't start herself. And I think that becomes part of it. And I think that's one of the ways. And I do think that that's something that we need to look at as a society, because that's why we're okay with her looking the way that she has, or have as much plastic surgery she's had, because she owns up to it, instead of just minding our own business and just celebrating her as a musician. We really like to pick apart bodies, right? And especially celebrity bodies, and the spaces that they kind of inhabit. And when you have older women who are daring to be very visible and very flashy and very campy, we struggle with that as a society. So I think it's good to have somebody like Dolly Parton and Cher and Madonna and so many other folks. Tina Turner is another one, right? Like people could not stop writing articles about Tina Turner's legs. And it's like, have you heard her sing? Great legs, but have you listened to the songs? Because that's really the point here, right? And so to continuously have these artists who are challenging that is good, but we're still struggling with that we still have only certain ways that we accept how certain women age, I think, in the music industry. And that's a big problem.
Well, and thinking about that and what what women are allowed to do today too, if we look at sort of the younger generations and what the expectations of these women and their aging bodies, and what those expectations are now. And I mean, there are a number of artists, I suppose, that play with that a lot. I mean, Lady Gaga was just something I don't know why that just came into my mind, but something around, how she's like, has talked about, I'm at the age, I'm aging out. And so how do I?
And you're like, she's how old? She's what, 34, 35? Yeah. Like, or Billie Eilish, I think, is another one who was very set on having boundaries around her physical body, and that she was very clear that she wore oversized clothes so that people couldn't judge her body. And then decided to shift her look and change and reinvent herself for her new album, and did this spread in Vogue where she's wearing kind of almost vintage looking lingerie. Beautiful, very, very classy, gorgeous photos, and has immediately been attacked. Well, you said you weren't going to show off your body. So you kind of can't blame Dolly Parton for having been as viciously protective of her boundaries as she has been over her decades-long career, because we look for any excuse to eviscerate, female performers.
Well, and this is it, right? Billie Eilish too, and that's it. Another person. Well, have you heard her sing or her music? Like,
or the songs that she writes? She's an incredible songwriter.
So again, it's where do we focus? Like where and again, this is the kind of stuff that I find incredibly actually boring, right? Like, who wants to keep having these kinds of things over and over and over again? And haven't we moved beyond this? But we get. There's just like being stuck here, right?
We're still talking about Dolly Parton's chest, and she's 75 years old. Like,
Tina Turner's legs. Here we go. And then what happens when we bring people, especially these incredible artists, creative, savvy businesswomen, there are so many things about them, such high intelligence, etc., and yet they're reduced to this, to one body part, and so again, the kinds of things that we need to keep challenging, which I think, and this is where we see Dolly has challenged it in a variety of different ways, but she's also owned it and taken it on and made it part of her business, right? Who Dolly is.
What she said in that interview, the joke's on them, and you have to respect that.
Yeah, for sure. We're just coming to the end of our conversation, and I know when we talked earlier, we said this will be so it'll fly by, and it certainly has. There's so much.
It has.
To talk about, but so yes, let me just do a little bit of our wrap up, and thank you so much, Cassie, for being here, for doing this with me. Of course, I always appreciate a good conversation about Dolly with you because of that enthusiasm and passion for all things Dolly. And the critique, which is really important as someone who has great fandom for someone to also be so open and thoughtful about, the need for a critique in our fandom and in those relationships as well. So we can, that's labor that's important that needs to be done. So I appreciate that as well. So we are going to do one more in this curated series, and that's coming up next month, and that's on Beyonce. And so going back to that comment about feminism, I mean, Beyonce, stood out and owned that word again. So I'm sure we'll have some great conversation about that and her sort of feminist politics and all of that. So that'll be great. I'm going to ask the folks that are out there if you could take a moment to fill out the evaluation form. Sarah's putting the link. They will post it to the comments section. And these are anonymous, and the RPL Film Theater really values your feedback. Our next film school will be live streamed on Thursday, June 3rd at 7 p.m. at the RPL Theater's Facebook and YouTube channels. Again, featuring the film Homecoming, a film by Beyonce, with a special guest, Dr. Fredera Hadley, who will be joining us, who's really a an amazing person, has written a lot on Beyonce, works with Beyonce's team a little bit. And so we'll have lots of inner scoop, hopefully. Anyway, and she's just a brilliant ethnomusicologist and someone who's just done some really powerful work. So I'm excited about that. And so thank you, Cassie, again. Thank you to the Dunlop Art Gallery, the RPL, for having us do this. This was great. And I'm just going to make sure that we have done all we need to do. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to check out Dolly Parton, Here I Am, please do so. Also, that really incredible podcast, Dolly's America, lots of good stuff in there.
So much good stuff. Thank you so much for having me. I'll talk about Dolly anytime. Thanks y'all for tuning in and watching, and feel free to follow up if you want to chat more Dolly or talk to me about why I was wrong about Elvis.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much, and hopefully we'll see you, talk to you next month. All right. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody. Bye.